Now, live from Studio 550, this is The McGraw Show on KTRS.
Our next guest, Evan Osnos, a writer for The New Yorker, spent 8 years reporting from China. He has a brand new book out getting a lot of attention. It's called The Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in New China. Evan, welcome to Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Glad to be with you.
It's an interesting book because you talk about basically the good, the bad, and the ugly coming out of China, right?
Yeah, that's the whole point. You've got it exactly right. You know, we often separate it, right? We talk about this big dynamic economy, the world's second largest, and then also a political system that looks like something out of the past. And I said, look, we've got to put these two things together because that's the big story. It's the collision between this really aspiration on one hand and authoritarianism on the other. And let's talk about it for what it is.
And it seems like they're struggling with it as well because they're a communist country, and yet they're bringing, this new world capitalism to the forefront. So how is it working?
Well, it's working with a lot of tension, and I think it's hard for us to miss that from far away. You know, when you look at China from here in the United States, what you see is 1/5 of the world's population, an economy now that is second only to the United States, and it's on its way, of course, to eventually becoming larger than ours. And yet internally, when you sit down with people at their dinner tables and you talk to them about their lives, you sort of get involved in their lives in the way that you do when you live there for 8 years, you discover that they have a lot of the same sorts of concerns that we do in the United States about how do you get health care for your parents, how do you get education for your kids, who you're going to marry. I mean, I'll give you an example. I followed a woman whose lives, I met her name is Gong Haiyan. I met her when she was in graduate school, and her parents were farmers who couldn't read or write, and she realized, my biggest problem is that I can't figure out who I'm going to marry because my parents can't introduce me to anybody who's like me. She had a great education. So she said, I'm going to start a company, and she started the Chinese equivalent of Match.com, ended up taking it public on the NASDAQ. She made $77 million before I left China. And that kind of thing was happening, in some sense, all around me in this very, very tight period of time. So that's the kind of story that often is hard to capture on the front page of the newspaper.
They still have the one-child rule, do they not?
They do. And if you think about how weird that is, that you have all of this control over your economic life and your personal life, but then the government, after all, still has these hard constraints on what you can do. They limit, for instance, how many children you can have. They're right now, though, moving to, in effect, a two-child policy, saying for a lot of the families that only have one child, they're going to be allowed to have a second child. But that's still, if you think, what a strange way it is to live, where you have that contradiction, those constraints around some parts of your life, around the political parts of your life, but not around the economic parts of your life.
Let's talk about the pollution, because what I'm hearing and what you just see on television, it seems like you can't walk down the street without coughing and wheezing.
It's a serious, serious problem. And when I got to China in 2005, I'll tell you that, foreigners were the ones who were complaining about pollution. I was one of the people that was complaining about it. Chinese people who hadn't really traveled, and they were very close to poverty. And so for them, pollution was sort of the cost of doing business. That has really changed. And that's part of an evolution that I'm describing in this book, which is that people have been, in a sense, awakened politically. Now, people in China can pick up their smartphone, they can look and see, the air I'm breathing today is 4 or 5 times the legal limit imposed by the World Health Organization. I demand better. I demand more of my government. So that kind of rising sense of expectation is essential for understanding the place. And I think it's going to pose greater challenges to the Chinese government in the years ahead. And we should be anticipating that they're going to have the kinds of political turmoil that has been a part of their past is going to be a reality in the future, and the government is contending with that possibility and trying to figure out how to deal with it.
The book is called Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. When are these internet billionaires and people who can pick up their smartphones, when are they going to want to vote for their own leaders?
It's a great question. If you look at other countries around the world, typically when they get to this point in their growth and their development, around $6,000 a year in annual income per capita, they start to move towards democracy. That's just a trend we see through history. China's government doesn't want that to happen. They are, at this point, on their way to being the world's longest-running one-party state. If they can make it to 2022, they will surpass the record set by the Soviet Union, and the government is acutely aware of that. So in a sense, what you see now is that you've got this rising population that they're trying to decide. Ordinary men and women, the kinds of people who I lived next door to in Beijing, are asking themselves every day, do I stand to gain more from the system as it's currently constituted, or do I want to try to bring about some sort of progressive reform? And really, those decisions are being made person by person, and those are the kinds of stories that I set out to tell.
Tiananmen Square was a generation ago. What happened to those dissidents and those people and that thread throughout society?
Well, we're about to mark 25 years this spring since the crackdown at Tiananmen Square. You remember that was this movement where the students poured into the center of Beijing, occupied really the sort of, the central heart of party power, and eventually it ended in bloodshed on June 4th. The government has conducted one of the more extraordinary acts of censorship we've ever seen, where the events of Tiananmen Square have been essentially expunged from the historical record. If you're a young person in school today, you know almost nothing about it. And yet older people, of course, they do know what happened. I mean, it's as if the United States had sought to remove the march from Selma, Alabama from our history books and said it never happened. So this is a fundamental contradiction, because you can't have people in a society who are able to do all of these enormously dynamic things economically, and yet there are parts of their own history that have been removed from the public record. So that kind of thing is becoming harder and harder for the government to defend.
Evan Osnos is our guest. The book is Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. Let's talk about the world power of China. They're friends with Russia. They sort of poke a stick in our eye from time to time, but they have a McDonald's, and no two countries that have McDonald's have ever gone to war with each other.
We're at this moment now where some of the old theories that really organized our political, diplomatic life about what kinds of countries would or would not come into conflict with each other, I think are being tested. If you look back over history, there have been 15 times over the last 500 years when a rising power, like China, for instance, has challenged an incumbent power like the United States. And in 11 of those cases, I'm sorry to say, it's ended in conflict. And so it's not to say that that's destiny. It's not. We're not ordained to end up in conflict with China. But what it means is we need to be aware of the risks, because the risks are real. And that's the strange thing. China today, exactly as you said, it is a country with McDonald's. It's a country that's got a kind of economy that is not all that much unlike our own, and yet its political system is fundamentally different. And so trying to look at China with clear eyes, without an ideology, without an agenda, is the goal of this project, and say, let's dig into people's lives with more detail than we've ever done before.
It's a book getting a lot of attention called Age of Ambition. Evan, you spent 8 years reporting from China. The book is Age of Ambition, Chasing Fortune, Truth, and Faith in the New China. Evan, good luck with the book. Thanks for checking in.
Many thanks. I appreciate it.
729, Big 550, KTR.